There is a name that history nearly buried, a woman born in the shadow of the most famous queen the world has ever known, Cleopatra. But before Cleopatra became Egypt's last pharaoh, before her love affairs with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony shaped the fate of empires, there was another queen, another heir to Egypt's throne, her sister, Arsinoe IV. Few remember her name today, and that's not an accident. She wasn't just forgotten by history, she was erased. The story of Arsinoe is one of rivalry, betrayal, and survival in a dynasty built on blood. She was born into a world where power was inherited not through love or fairness, but through cunning and conquest. To be born a Ptolemy was both a privilege and a curse. The Ptolemies were not Egyptians by blood. They were Greeks, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals. They ruled Egypt as foreigners for nearly 3 centuries, taking the titles of pharaohs but living like Greek monarchs. And as with most royal families of the Hellenistic age, their greatest enemies weren't rivals from other nations, but their own relatives. By the time Arsinoe was born around 68 BCE, the royal palace in Alexandria was more like a gilded prison. Every sibling was a potential threat. Every feast could turn fatal. The air inside the marble corridors was thick with perfume and paranoia. Arsinoe was the daughter of Ptolemy XII Oletes, known as the flute player, a weak ruler whose love of luxury bankrupted Egypt. He was so desperate to keep his throne that he bribed Roman politicians for support. And when that failed, he fled Egypt altogether, leaving his daughters to fend for themselves. Cleopatra was around 18 then, clever, fluent in several languages, already showing the political brilliance that would make her legendary. Arsinoe, her younger sister by a few years, grew up watching Cleopatra rise, learning the same arts of charm, rhetoric, and persuasion. But she also learned something else, that in their family, only one could rule. When their father died in 51 BCE, the throne of Egypt was inherited jointly by Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, a boy of about 10. Arsinoe was next in line, young and ambitious, but for now, she stood in the shadows. At first, Cleopatra tried to rule alone, portraying herself as the true heir of her father's legacy. But the boy king's advisors, especially a ruthless man named Pothinus, turned him against her. Soon, Cleopatra was driven out of Alexandria and forced to flee into the desert, stripped of her title and her power. It should have been the end of her story. But Cleopatra had always known how to turn her beauty and brilliance into weapons. She found her way into the camp of Julius Caesar, who had just arrived in Egypt to settle the royal dispute on Rome's behalf. Cleopatra famously had herself smuggled into his chambers, legend says wrapped in a carpet. And from that night on, everything changed. Arsinoe, watching from within the palace walls, must have understood immediately what her sister was doing. And she must have known that if Cleopatra succeeded in winning Caesar's favor, there would be no place for her, because in the Ptolemaic world, there was never enough power to share. As Caesar and Cleopatra solidified their alliance, Arsinoe made a fateful decision. She would not wait to be outplayed. She fled the palace, slipping away under the cover of darkness, and joined the Egyptian army that had turned against Caesar's forces. The people of Alexandria, resentful of foreign interference, needed a leader. Someone of royal blood, someone they could rally behind. Arsinoe stepped into that role with confidence. She declared herself queen, and for a brief and electrifying moment, became the symbol of Egyptian resistance. For the first time in her young life, Arsinoe was not a sister, or a pawn, or a shadow. She was a queen in her own right, and she was at war with both Cleopatra and Rome. Caesar, who had expected an easy victory, suddenly found himself trapped in the city. The Nile ran red with battle. The once golden capital of the Ptolemies became a maze of barricades and fire. In those brutal weeks, Arsinoe proved herself shrewd and fearless, directing her generals, making speeches to soldiers, and rallying Alexandrians with the promise that Egypt could still belong to its own people. But even brilliance has limits when Rome is your enemy. When Caesar's reinforcements arrived from Syria, Arsinoe's army began to crumble. She was betrayed, captured, and brought before Julius Caesar himself. A teenage girl, once called Pharaoh, now standing in chains before the most powerful man in the world. What happened next would determine not only her fate, but her sister's legacy. When Arsinoe was brought before Julius Caesar in chains, she was barely 17 years old. The crowds who gathered to see her expected a broken girl, terrified, humbled, begging for mercy. But what they saw instead was a queen who refused to bow. Even in captivity, Arsinoe carried herself like royalty. She met Caesar's gaze without fear, her dark eyes steady, her spine unbent. There was something almost defiant in the way she stood, as though she were daring him to remember that she, too, was born of divine blood, descended from the gods themselves. Caesar, ever the showman, saw an opportunity. He didn't have Arsinoe executed on the spot. Instead, he decided to use her, to parade her through the streets of Rome as a living trophy of his Egyptian campaign. And so, in 46 BCE, the city of Rome prepared for one of the most extravagant spectacles of Caesar's rule, his triumph. Tens of thousands crowded the streets as trumpets blared and banners fluttered. Painted floats rolled by, showing scenes of victory. Roman legions conquering foreign lands, golden statues of the Nile, and the treasures of Alexandria glittering in the sun. Then came the captives, chained nobles, foreign kings, and priests, all reminders of Caesar's power. But at the center of the procession, the crowd gasped. There she was, Arsinoe, the princess of Egypt, barefoot and draped in gold chains, so heavy she could barely walk. Her white gown was torn, her head unbowed, her eyes fierce. She was the living embodiment of Egypt's defeat, the woman who had dared defy Rome itself. The Romans expected her to cry, to collapse, to beg for life. But Arsinoe did none of those things. She walked in silence, her pride untouched. And in that silence, she humiliated Caesar more deeply than any words could. The spectacle that was meant to display her weakness instead became a testament to her strength. The crowd, the same Romans who had cheered her humiliation, began to pity her. Some even began to admire her, and Caesar noticed. He had planned to execute her at the end of the parade, as was Roman custom, but when the crowd began to shout for mercy, he hesitated. The people were charmed by her courage, and Caesar, ever attuned to public mood, relented. In a rare gesture of clemency, he spared Arsinoe's life. Instead of execution, she was exiled not to Egypt, but to the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, in what is now modern-day Turkey. There, she would live as a prisoner in all but name, a protected exile under Rome's watchful eye. But for Arsinoe, exile was not the same as defeat. Within the white marble columns of the temple, surrounded by priestesses in silence, she rebuilt herself. She was no longer a pawn in Caesar's theater or Cleopatra's rival in the Alexandrian court. For the first time, she had peace and the safety of holy ground. And yet, peace has a way of unsettling those who thrive on power. In Egypt, Cleopatra had everything she'd ever wanted: the throne, Caesar's love, the wealth of the Nile. But there was still one shadow she could not erase. Arsinoe was alive. Even across the sea, Cleopatra knew her sister's existence was dangerous. Arsinoe represented something she could not afford: a rival claimant to the throne, a living reminder that the Queen of Egypt had once been challenged and nearly defeated by her own blood. And worse, the people remembered. Whispers drifted through Alexandria's marketplaces that Arsinoe was the rightful queen, the one who had fought for Egypt while Cleopatra sold its sovereignty to Rome. Cleopatra's power was absolute, but fragile. She knew how quickly affection could turn to rebellion, how quickly Rome's favor could fade. Years passed. Caesar was assassinated. The world of Rome erupted into chaos once again, and as the empire splintered, Cleopatra turned her attention to a new ally, Mark Antony. Together, Cleopatra and Antony would build a new vision of empire, one that rivaled Rome itself. But before that dream could take shape, there was something she needed to do, a loose end. Far from Alexandria, in the quiet sanctuary of Ephesus, Arsinoe was still alive, still young, still royal. When Cleopatra learned that Mark Antony would soon travel east to meet his generals, she saw her chance. She pleaded with him to grant her a single request, that Arsinoe be eliminated. It wasn't a military demand or a political strategy. It was personal. Cleopatra wanted her sister gone, erased from memory, from history, from life itself. Antony hesitated at first. To kill someone within a sacred temple, a sanctuary protected by the gods, was unthinkable. But Cleopatra was persuasive. She reminded him that Arsinoe had once commanded armies against Caesar himself, that she was a symbol of rebellion. And so, reluctantly, Antony agreed. Roman soldiers were dispatched to Ephesus under cover of night. They entered the Temple of Artemis, one of the holiest sites in the ancient world, and found Arsinoe there. She was dragged down the temple steps, crying out to the priestesses who had sheltered her. The women tried to stop the soldiers, but the order had come from Rome, or rather, from Alexandria. At the base of the temple, beneath the shadow of the marble pillars, Arsinoe IV, the forgotten queen Cleopatra's sister, once a pharaoh in her own right, was executed. She was around 20 years old. The blood that stained the sacred steps of Artemis would never fully wash away. The Roman world was shocked. Even in an age of ruthless politics, the murder of a royal woman on holy ground was seen as a sin against the gods themselves. But for Cleopatra, it was over. At last, the last rival to her throne was gone. The story of Egypt would be hers alone to tell. In the silence that followed Arsinoe's death, the world quickly forgot her name. There was no grand tomb, no royal funeral, no mourning procession on the Nile. Her story was smothered beneath the myths that grew around Cleopatra. The radiant queen who defied Rome, the lover of Caesar and Antony, the tragic heroine who died by her own hand. Cleopatra became immortal. Arsinoe became invisible. For centuries, the two sisters were remembered not as women, but as symbols, one embodying seduction and power, the other erased so completely that even scholars debated whether she ever existed at all. Yet history has a strange way of reviving the forgotten, and sometimes what's buried refuses to stay silent. Almost 2,000 years after Arsinoe's murder in the ancient city of Ephesus, the very place where she died, archaeologists made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the historical world. At the base of the Temple of Artemis, among crumbling marble and wild fig trees, they unearthed an octagonal tomb. Inside were the remains of a young woman, bones slender and delicate, adorned with faint traces of gold leaf, as if once wrapped in royal fabric. The tomb was dated to the very period of Arsinoe's life and death, and more striking still, its design combined both Greek and Egyptian elements, a blend of cultures only a Ptolemaic royal could claim. Could this be the final resting place of Cleopatra's forgotten sister? The discovery ignited fierce debate. Some archaeologists were convinced the placement, the age, the artistry, all pointed to Arsinoe IV. Others dismissed it, arguing there wasn't enough evidence, that bones alone could not rewrite history. But for many, the possibility was too haunting to ignore. The woman in the tomb, perhaps just 16 or 17 when she died, bore traces of a life lived between worlds. Even in death, she was Greek and Egyptian, royal and exiled, worshipped and destroyed. Modern forensic artists attempted to reconstruct her face. Using digital modeling and cranial analysis, they shaped her features. A delicate jawline, high cheekbones, a proud brow. The results stunned historians. She didn't look purely Greek nor fully Egyptian. Her face was a perfect bridge between East and West, between myth and reality. It was as if history itself was whispering, "Remember her." And yet, not everyone wanted to. When the reconstruction was revealed, some scholars objected, saying that suggesting Cleopatra and Arsinoe might have had African ancestry was political. Others said the reconstruction blurred the lines between science and imagination. But perhaps that was fitting, because Arsinoe's story had always lived somewhere between both. She was born into a dynasty of conquerors and gods, raised in a world of opulence and deceit, and killed for being too close to power. In every way, her life mirrored Cleopatra's. The same blood, the same ambition, the same beauty. The difference was that Cleopatra won history's stage, while Arsinoe was cut from the script. But maybe that's why her rediscovery matters so much, because her story forces us to question what history chooses to remember and what it tries to forget. When we look at the reconstructed face of Arsinoe IV, we don't just see Cleopatra's sister. We see all the women erased by empire, all the voices silenced by politics, all the names buried so another could shine. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all, that Cleopatra's own legacy, built on charm, intelligence, and survival, rests on a silence her sister paid for with her life. Today, if you visit Ephesus, you can still walk among the ruins of the temple where Arsinoe's blood was spilled. You can still stand before the faint outline of that octagonal tomb and imagine the girl queen who once defied Rome and her own bloodline. There, under the same sky that once watched her die, the wind still whispers through the marble, a forgotten name, a lost crown, a life stolen by history. Arsinoe IV, the sister, the queen, the shadow, was meant to vanish. But in truth, she never really did. She lived on in the stones of Ephesus, in the DNA of a dynasty, and now in the image of her reconstructed face, a reminder that even those erased from history can still find a way to be seen.